In this video, we're going to discuss the three most common types of exceptions in Selenium WebDriver. And these are InvalidSelectorException, NoSuchElementException, and StaleElementReferenceException. You're watching AutomateNow. This is Marco Cruz. Let's dive in.
Alright, so the first exception that we're going to discuss is called InvalidSelectorException. This can occur when you have a CSS or an XPath locator that has some invalid syntax. So let's take a look at the AutomateNow website. The sandbox page contains all these buttons right here. One of them is this form fields. We have created a test in the past which clicks on this button right here. Let's take a look at that test. And here we have that test. It's called test enter text. On line 38, we see this right here. It says sandbox page that click form fields. Let's go to the sandbox page object. And here's the locator for that button here, form fields button. We see that this is an anchor tag which contains a given text right here. We said that in order to get that exception, there would have to be some kind of issue with this locator right here. And to make this test fail, what I'm going to do is going to remove this bracket right here. I'm going to delete that, and we're going to run this test to see what happens. And here we see that the test has failed with this exception, InvalidSelectorException. And it says invalid selector, unable to locate element with XPath, and it gives you the XPath that it's looking for. Notice that it is missing the bracket that we removed. So if you get this type of exception, what you need to do is to make sure that the locator that you're using is valid. The Selenium website offers a few options here: CSS validator and XPath validator. You can check those out to validate your CSS. The next exception that we're going to take a look at is called NoSuchElementException. And this can occur when the web element is not present. So going back to this test right here, we have the form fields button, which contains this text right here, form fields. Now what I'm going to do is to change this text right here. Instead of form fields, I'm going to add an extra S at the end. So when we go to the website and it tries to find this text called form fields with an extra S, it won't be able to find it. Let's see what happens when we run the test. And here we see that the test failed with NoSuchElementException. Notice that it tells you that it's unable to find the element, and it gives you the locator right here. So we're trying to locate this element right here with this extra S at the end, but we're not able to find it, and that's why we get this error. So if you see this type of thing, just make sure that whatever element that you're trying to find, that such element is actually on the page. The last exception that we're going to discuss is called StaleElementReferenceException, and this can occur under these two circumstances. The first one is called element has been deleted entirely, and the second one is called element is no longer attached to the DOM. I'm going to give you an example of the second case right here, but before I do that, I want you to pay attention to these two words right here. It's called element reference. What happens is that when we use Selenium WebDriver to locate an element, it stores a reference to that web element, and that is the reference that is an issue. So for example, if something happens to the website, some jQuery action or some other action causes the reference to that element to be lost, then it throws this exception. Let me give you an example. I'm going to go to the website here, and I'm going to see this button right here. We created a test in the past for this button. We locate this button, and then we take a screenshot of it. Let's go to that test right now. This is the test element screenshot. And it's just taking a screenshot of that modals button. Let's go to the base page object. And here we see the method that is in charge of taking that screenshot. The first thing that it does is that it locates the element that we're trying to take the screenshot of. And then it takes the screenshot and then it saves the file. So when it locates this element right here, it is going to store a reference to this element. And this reference is later used in the test. So after we locate this element, it stores the reference. And here we're using that reference to get the screenshot of that element. I'm going to put a breakpoint right here, and I'm going to run this test to show you that reference. Okay, so we have arrived at the breakpoint, and we're about to get the reference to that web element. Here we have clicked on the debug tab to be able to see all the variables. I'm going to click on this button now to step over this line of code. And now we have found that element right here. I'm going to expand this, and notice right here, we have a unique ID. This is the ID that Selenium has assigned to this web element reference. Let me go back to the website. And now I'm going to click the refresh button. By clicking this refresh button, I have caused that reference to that element to be lost. Now let's go back and finish executing the test. And notice that this test has failed. It says StaleElementReferenceException. StaleElementReference element is no longer attached to the page document. We know that the element is still there on the page, but the reference to that element was lost as soon as I refreshed the page. To make my point more clear, let's do something here. I'm going to duplicate this line of code, and this one we're going to call element number 2. So when we locate this element, then locate the element again, and we're going to compare the references of these two elements. Let's go ahead and run the test. Okay, so we hit the breakpoint. Now let's go ahead and step over this, and we have located the element. Here's the first reference. Let's go ahead and step over this one more time, and now we have located the second reference. Let's go ahead and expand these. And the thing that we're going to take a look at is the IDs. Notice that the IDs both end in 2578, and this one also 2578. So the IDs are identical. The reference to both of these web elements is the same. Next, I'm going to rerun this test, but before we get the second reference, we're going to refresh the page, and we're going to compare the references. So let's go ahead and rerun this test. Okay, so we hit the breakpoint, and this time what we're going to do, we're going to get the first reference. So let's go ahead and step over this line of code, and we have the first reference. Before we get the second reference, we're going to refresh the page. So let's go back to the website and hit the refresh button. Now we're going to go back to the test and get the second reference. Now we're going to inspect each one of these. Notice that the ID for the first reference ends in 51F2. The ID to the second reference ends in AB52. So they're clearly different. And this is what I was talking about. If something happens with the page, the reference to the element gets lost, and that's why you get that StaleElementReferenceException. And that's all for this week's video. I hope you had fun learning about exceptions. I'll see you in the next video.